Welcome back to Steel City Sports. So today is my official breakdown of the Pittsburgh Steelers 2024 NFL schedule. So I want to say right off the bat that I tried to be as unbiased with all these matchups as I can be, and I want to explain thoroughly why I have the Steelers either winning or losing each game. We're going to break all of them down. And I also want to say up front that I have them getting off to a pretty strong start. So there's going to be a point about midway through the schedule here where I have them with a pretty good record. So just because I have them with that good record doesn't mean I think they're going to be a Super Bowl contender or I have some dumb Yinzer bias where I think they're going to be super good. Keep in mind, the back half of the Steelers' schedule is extremely brutal. So we're going to break down each individual game. Let's get into it right now. So starting off with week 1, we go down to Atlanta to play the Falcons. They had a record of 7-10 last year. So I tried to do this with each team, identify their pros and cons. So let's get into the pros. They're going to have a potentially high-powered offense. You look at all the draft capital, the high-end draft capital that they've invested on offensive pieces between Kyle Pitts, Drake London, and Bijan Robinson, all being top 10 picks in different draft class. They also had the 4th-rated offensive line last year to pair that with signing Kirk Cousins, who's an automatic upgrade, like a significant, massive upgrade over Desmond Ridder, who I don't even know if Desmond Ridder is an NFL-level player, and he was their starter last year. And even if it's Penix, we're going to talk about Penix a little later, but even if Michael Penix is the Week 1 starter because Kirk isn't still physically 100% ready because of the injury, I still think Michael Penix is a massive upgrade over Desmond Ridder. So whoever's taken the snaps at quarterback to start off the year, they are surrounded by a great supporting cast of weapons, and I'm expecting a massive year from Bijan Robinson. I feel like he's really going to break out in year 2. So the next pro I have listed here is they have really high-end secondary talent between A.J. Terrell, one of the best young corners in football, and Jesse Bates. I think you can realistically make an argument that Jesse Bates is the best safety in football. Now, I personally wouldn't put him there, but if you wanted to argue the case to me, I'd be willing to listen. I think he's at worst top 3 safety in football right now. So that does worry me a little for the Steelers because bringing Russ into a new team, they could, be trying to get him comfortable in the passing game. Well, they got really good secondary players to kind of go at George Pickens. And outside of George Pickens, we don't have an established weapon on this team. Deontay Johnson's gone, and then it's just a bunch of dudes like Quez Watkins, Van Jefferson, our rookie Roman Wilson. There's not really a proven guy outside of Pickens. So that does worry me for the Steelers in this game is if they are able to neutralize that side of the field with Pickens on it. The lack of playmakers outside him does worry me. And then the last pro I have is Raheem Morris. I think is a significant upgrade over Arthur Smith. Arthur Smith is our offensive coordinator now. I think he's much more suited to be a coordinator, just was not ready to be a head coach, whereas Raheem Morris, I think, is 100% ready to be a coach and was, I think, one of the best coordinators last year. When you look at the defensive personnel of the Rams, they only had one first-round draft pick on that defense, which was Aaron Donald. Everyone else was drafted, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. And he was really, he did a great job of coaching guys up and getting the maximum talent out of them. So I think Raheem Morris is actually going to work as a head coach. So now let's look at their cons. So right off the bat, starting quarterback, we already kind of touched on this. Is Kirk going to be 100% ready to go? Because I don't know. Because it's not like he got the injury like early in the season. It was like midway through last year. So there's a chance Kirk Cousins still isn't 100% ready to go. That means Michael Penix, a rookie, could potentially be starting. And then my next con is they had a bad draft. They had one of the worst drafts of any of the teams in the NFL. And this is even outside of the Michael Penix pick, which makes no sense to begin with. I still have people trying to argue with me that the Michael Penix pick makes sense. No, it does not. Because if that was the plan to take him, paying Kirk Cousins $180 million guaranteed makes absolutely zero fucking sense. So I'm sick and tired of people trying to tell me that makes sense. No, it does not. I'll argue with you down in the comments if you still want to talk about that. But even outside of drafting Penix, like all the other guys they drafted, I literally didn't know any of them. And I don't claim to be some, scholar of the NFL draft and know every single prospect, but I did, for the channel, I did a lot of research for mock drafts and stuff like that, so I felt comfortable with at least the first, 3 or 4 rounds, those level of guys. And I didn't recognize any name of the guys they drafted outside of Michael Penix Jr. And then our last con is the lack of pass rush is I think their biggest glaring need. Another reason why their draft was so bad is because their biggest need was pass rush, and they could have easily addressed that at 8 with Dallas Turner or Verse or Latu, like whoever. They could have taken the top pass rushing guy on their board, and that's just another reason why their draft sucked, in my opinion, is they failed to address their biggest position of need. So they have a very lackluster pass rush to go up against the Steelers. And for some of the teams, I did put a miscellaneous note if it applied to them. In this case, it does because it's Arthur Smith's old team, so he's obviously got some added motivation to beat them because they just fired his ass. But ultimately, my prediction is the Steelers will win this one. I think we have the talent advantage. The uncertainty with who's actually going to be the starting quarterback and their lack of a pass rush, I think the Steelers are just going to be able to take care of the Atlanta Falcons, start off the year 1-0. And for week 2, we head out to Denver to play the Broncos. They had a record of 8-9 last year. So I'll be upfront with you guys. The Broncos, for me, they were a difficult team to point out realistic pros for because I think they are legitimately going to be one of the worst teams in the NFL last year. So I was kind of grasping at straws here to find pros. The first one I put is Sean Payton can elevate mediocre talent, which is true, and I've been a very vocal critic against Sean Payton. I've always pushed back on people saying he's like an all-time great head coach. I think he's a good head coach. I don't see elite with him, especially in his final tenure with the Saints, where he had year in and year out some of the most talented teams of that decade and always came up short in the playoffs. But you can't deny his ability to elevate mediocre talent, especially at the quarterback position, where he made like Taysom Hill look like an actual option at quarterback. That little stretch at the beginning of the 2021 season with Jameis, before Jameis got hurt, actually was looking incredible. I don't know if many people remember that, but that 4 or 5 sample size there with Jameis, he beat back-to-back MVP Aaron to start off the year. And, of course, always working with Drew Brees. So Bo Nix is going to benefit a lot from having Sean Payton. And this is the only team for a pro where I just put a player. Like, that's how difficult it was for me to find pros for the Broncos, where I literally just had to put their best player down in Patrick Surtain. But he is a pro. He can shut down an entire side of a field. And especially, like we just talked about with the Falcons matchup, is Russell Wilson in a new system. If you neutralize his number one option, that is going to be definitely a matchup advantage for the Denver Broncos. Let's take a look at their cons. Number 1, rookie quarterback, Bo Nix. Bo Nix, out of all of the first-round quarterbacks, is the one where I don't know what to make of him. If he comes in and he has a pretty high floor and is pretty decent, I wouldn't be too surprised. If he just sucked, was terrible, I honestly wouldn't even be too surprised at that because it took him to get like the perfect setup, the perfect coach, the perfect roster in Oregon to really pop. Whereas you look at his Auburn tape, it is brutal. So I just don't know with Bo Nix. There's a lot of unproven with him. And another con, just flat out, they have a bad roster. I just put bad overall roster because this team is really lacking in high-end talent. Outside of Patrick Surtain, there's really not a lot of talent on this roster. And then unproven is the last one because they made a lot of changes to their team last year. Their team was already a mediocre team, a below-average team last year, and they found a way to get, I think, significantly worse. Because as bad as Russ was, you can talk about that all you want. Was Russell Wilson bad enough to pay him $40+ million to play for another team? I don't think so. And you also lost Justin Simmons, another elite safety. So overall, I just think from a talent perspective, a roster standpoint, the Denver Broncos have zero business competing with the Pittsburgh Steelers. But I did put here, as you can see in miscellaneous notes, Russell Wilson versus Sean Payton. It's clear Sean Payton fucking hated Russ's guts, and I'm sure Russ doesn't like him back after, publicly embarrassing him and cutting him and saying he sucks. So I wonder if this is actually going to be, and I guess I could have looked, but I wonder if this is going to be a prime game or a prime time matchup, whether it's Monday Night Football or Sunday Night Football or whatever, because you do have that storyline of Russ versus Sean Payton. So I'm interested to see that dynamic play out. Russ is obviously going to have massive added motivation to beat up on the guy who basically told the world that he sucked at football. So I do have the Steelers winning this one for all the reasons I just mentioned, which brings us up to 2-0. And for week 3, we have our first home game of the year where we host the Los Angeles Chargers. Last year, they had a record of 5-12 and were one of the most drastically disappointing teams of last year. And I think we all know the biggest reason why. If you're a long-term listener here on the channel, Brandon Staley was public enemy number 1. And I said after that game against the Raiders, if he wasn't fired within the next 2 days, I was going to blackball the Chargers from this channel. We were never going to talk about them again. Thankfully, for their sake, they did the right thing. They got rid of Brandon Staley, and they cleaned house as well because they also fired their GM, Tom Telesco, who's now the Raiders GM. So they completely cleaned house in terms of their coaching staff and their front office, which I like to see because the amount of talent on this roster, especially the amount of talent they had last year and winning 5 games, is unexcusable. Like, you cannot keep your job after that happening. But let's take a look at their team this year. So the pros, right off the bat, the obvious one is Jim Harbaugh, who has a proven track record of winning everywhere he's gone as a head coach. You look at his start in San Diego State, you look at Stanford, you look at the 49ers, you look at Michigan. He's gone to all these brands and built them into legit contenders, and with Michigan, obviously, actually won a natty this past year. And I think he's going to instantly implement a winning culture with the Chargers, which is such a drastic night and day difference from Brandon Staley. My next big pro for the Chargers is I actually really liked their draft. Even though they didn't do exactly what I would have done, that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't good, because I still would have probably drafted Malik Neighbors at 5, but I'm glad that they at least later on down the draft did address wide receiver. But Joe Alt, just in terms of Harbaugh, knowing Harbaugh's philosophy of the game of football, where he wants to build through the trenches and prioritize the run game, the pick makes a lot of sense. And ultimately, I can't really be mad at a team for drafting such a high-end player in Joe Alt, who realistically could be the best player in this entire class. He has that level of upside. I think he's going to be a perennial all-pro level guy. So, yeah, maybe not the guy I would have taken, but still, I can't really knock the pick. It still makes a ton of sense. They're starting to build up an elite-level line now that you have 2 legit Pro Bowl level guys at both tackles positions with Rashawn Slater and now Joe Alt. And then, like we said, in the second round, they did address the wide receiver position with Ladd McConkey, who I thought could have been a fringe first-round guy. They ended up getting him in the early second round. The guy's always open. He was at Georgia, and, Justin Herbert has kind of made a career of playing fine without elite level guys. Like, he's had elite guys, obviously, with Keenan Allen and Mike Williams when he was healthy, but even like when those guys were injured, he still didn't really miss a beat. So I think Ladd McConkey is going to fit in perfectly. And the last big pro I have for the Chargers is they still have a lot of high-end talent on this roster. Despite losing those 2 receivers, you still have Justin Herbert, who, when fully healthy, I think is easily a top 5 quarterback in the NFL, has been nothing but a pure production machine ever since he entered the NFL, despite dealing with incompetency at head coaches, the management being kind of poorly ran. So Justin Herbert, still a stud. You got the 2 elite pass rushers with Khalil Mack coming off of arguably the best year of his career. Like, he just put up, I want to say, like a 16-sack season. Like, Khalil Mack, I get it. It was in a kind of a contract year, but and I get he's up there in age, but he still has the explosive athleticism like he's still in his prime. Bosa, when healthy, we know how productive he can be. You still got Derwin James, who I think can still be an all-pro level guy. And another one of their draft picks I really liked was Junior Colson from Michigan, who I think is going to develop into elite linebacker, obviously has the familiarity with Harbaugh. So I like a lot of their high-end guys in place. Let's take a quick look at their cons. I only have 2 for the Chargers. The first one is kind of the obvious one. They have a lackluster wide receiver room, obviously, after trading away Keenan Allen to the Bears and cutting Mike Williams. And it really came down to there were 4 guys that they had to make decisions on this offseason. It was those 2 receivers, and it was Khalil Mack and Bosa. And knowing Harbaugh, what does he do? He prioritizes the pass rushers instead of the wide receivers. again, maybe not the thing I would have done, but Jim Harbaugh obviously knows way more than I do, and he prioritized the defensive guys. So that's why they're gone. Although, like I said, Justin Herbert has been fine when those guys are injured. Like, he can play with scrubs. He could take you and me and be fine. I feel like Justin Herbert, I mean, he's one of the guys that I'm not too worried about. I mean, he doesn't need he's not like a Kirk Cousins or a Brock Purdy or like a Dak. He's not a guy who needs playmakers around him to be good. Obviously, it helps when you have that, but he's not, he doesn't need carried like that. And then my other one is Gus Edwards is not proven as a number one running back in the NFL. We kind of saw this last year with Tony Pollard, where he had a great year, and they were like, okay, he had a great year as the number 2 guy, and then they got rid of Zeke in Dallas, and they gave last year to Tony Pollard, and he disappointed as a number 1. This is kind of that year for Gus Edwards, because he's been a good guy in the rotation for Baltimore. But they, dealing with the injuries they had last year to J.K. Dobbins, the last 2 years going into the season was supposed to be their number 1 running back, but he got hurt both years, so Gus Edwards kind of had to step up. And me saying he's unproven as a number 1, that's not me trying to hate. Like, I actually really like Gus Edwards despite him being a Raven. I just really like his style of play. He kind of reminds me of a very light version of Derrick Henry, which is kind of ironic because Derrick Henry's the guy who replaced him. But and also did pick him up in fantasy, and he was a stud towards the later part of the year. So I'm always going to kind of root for the Gus bus. But when we talk about the philosophy of Harbaugh and how much emphasis he places on the run game, I would think running back would be one of the most important positions on a Harbaugh-led team. So it's kind of weird for me that he would have an unproven number 1 running back as the lead guy. So I'm just interested to see early on how Gus Edwards transitions from being like a guy who was part of a running back committee in Baltimore, where now he's the clear number 1 back with the Chargers. But all that to be said, I think the Steelers are going to lose this one. They're going to lose the home opener, in my opinion, just for the simple fact that I think the Chargers just have a clear talent advantage. I think they have a better player-for-player roster than the Steelers. And you look at, even though we did invest heavily in our offensive line in the draft, they're still young guys. It's still kind of a thrown-together unit that's young, still needs a lot of development. And you look at one of the strongest parts of the Chargers team is that pass rush of Bosa and Khalil Mack, who I think could really wreck our young offensive line. And just on top of that, of course, Justin Herbert. I mean, Justin Herbert is like I said, top 5 level quarterback when healthy. And anytime you got that guy, anytime you have that big of a quarterback advantage, you should probably win the game. I did have here real quick a miscellaneous note. These teams are similar in terms of their style. Now, are they going to be the same in terms of like what it looks like on TV? I don't know. But in terms of like what they've prioritized this offseason, I think they're actually going to be similar teams in terms of, we built heavily in the trenches with the draft, and Arthur Smith places a big priority on running the ball. Well, who else does that? Jim Harbaugh. So I think that this is going to be more of like an old school type of game, where it's more of like a physical game. It's more low scoring. It's going to be more defensive oriented. So I think the Chargers are going to pull this out in kind of a low scoring game. For week 4, we go to Indianapolis to play the Colts. They had a record of 9-8 last year. They really were one of the most surprising teams last season, because I think everyone assumed after Anthony Richardson got hurt, their season was done. But they went all the way up to the last game of the season to be eliminated from playoff contention. We did play the Colts last year. We lost that game. It was one of the worst games I've ever seen the Pittsburgh Steelers play since I've started watching the Steelers, because of Mitch Trubisky. Mitch Trubisky, this was the worst game of his career, and the game that, solidified the fact that he should not have a job in the National Football League. It was about as fun as getting your fucking teeth ripped out with a pair of pliers and someone dumping acid in your eyes. That's how fun it was to watch Trubisky play in this game. He was fucking dreadfully terrible. But as for this year for the Colts, let's look at their pros. Shane Steichen's the number 1 thing. And why do I have their head coach just listed here? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. I think Shane Steichen can elevate probably you or me to be an average NFL quarterback. Like, the guy is a offensive genius. So look at what he did when he was the offensive coordinator for the Eagles. How good Jalen Hurts had. Jalen Hurts had by far the best year of his career and was the runner-up for MVP and outdueled Patrick Mahomes. Even though they lost that Super Bowl, he did, 1-to-1 outplay Patrick Mahomes in that Super Bowl with Steichen as his play caller. Then this past year, you look at what he did with Gardner Minshew, and like we just said, came like a play out of missing playoffs with a backup quarterback and kind of a mediocre roster. So Shane Steichen, I really think he is the next Kyle Shanahan, the next Sean McVay. Like, if Anthony Richardson is a legit quarterback, then this team is going to be a perennial playoff team for the next 10 years. And Steichen is the biggest reason for that. He's an offensive genius, and I think has potential to be like a top 5 head coach in the NFL. The next thing, I think their first and second round picks were incredible. I think they had some of the best value picks in both the first and second round. You look at the first, they got Latu, who could really turn out to be the best defensive prospect in the class. And you could correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure Latu was the first defensive player off the board, but they didn't have to trade up. They didn't have to move to get him at 15. And the injury stuff doesn't really bug me with him. Like, if it weren't for the injury stuff, I think Latu would have went a lot higher up in this draft. Ever since he, got cleared of that, the past 2 seasons, he has a full, clean bill of health and led the nation in sacks. He was the most productive sack machine in college football over 2 seasons. The neck injury is so far in the past, it doesn't worry me. I think he's going to be an absolute monster. The fact that you got that level of a prospect with that much potential to be such a disruptive pass rusher, you got him at 15. Usually those guys, those level of talent guys, go in like the top 3. So he fell just because of the neck injury concerns. If that doesn't happen, like if the injuries don't affect his career and he just turns out to be a stud, you got incredible value with that pick at 15. And for the second round, I think you can make the case that they had the best value pick of the entire second round, getting Adonai Mitchell, the wide receiver from Texas, with, I don't remember what overall pick it was, but it was, middle of the second round. A guy that I thought could have easily went in the first round. In my mock draft, I had him going to the Bills, and obviously the Bills ended up going with Keon Coleman earlier in the second round. But I know that Adonai Mitchell has some, off the field concerns, but in terms of the tape, it speaks for itself. The guy is an elite level talent. I think he can be a high-end productive guy, and the fact that he was, the 11th receiver off the board is, I think, exceptional value, and they really addressed a strong position of need on this team, which is receiver. Michael Pittman's really, a good player, but outside of him at wide receiver, it's one of the most thin receiver cores in the league, so I'm glad that they addressed a position of need and getting incredible value. And Adonai Mitchell could maybe even in the near future surpass the talent of Michael Pittman and could be the number 1 on this team. So I really like their draft. And my last big pro for the Colts is Jonathan Taylor, barring a major injury, should play the full year. I can't remember exactly what happened, the circumstances last year, but we all know he missed basically a big chunk of last year. But you go the year before that, he was in an argument. He was in the conversation for the best running back in the NFL. I don't know if he was the best running back, but he was in the conversation. He was at worst top 3 when you just look at the 2022 season. Then like I said, this past year, weird start. He had, troubles with the owner and kind of negotiating his contract and all that bullshit. But now there's none of that going on. He's paid. They paid him an extension for 3 or 4 years. So he will be back fully engaged to enter next year. Hopefully for their sake, they're getting the 2022 version of Jonathan Taylor to pair that with the upside of AR and the play calling of Steichen could be an extremely potent and dangerous offense. Let's take a look at their cons, though. The uncertainty of Anthony Richardson. I think he's going to work out. I really do. But the sample size of him in the NFL is 3.5 games. So, I can't just say flat out that he's going to work out. I think that would be kind of naive for me to do. But if I had to bet, I think he's going to work out. The poise he played in He was a lot better than what I thought he would be in those first couple games last year, because I thought he was going to be one of the most raw prospects of the draft, and it turned out he was like a day one starter. He looked really good. He had the accuracy. He showed off that raw athleticism, which is why he got drafted so high. And I just think that the sky is the limit for that guy. I think he's going to be a stud, but it's a con for now because it's not proven. It's not certain that he's going to work out. So the fact that it's kind of up in the air, if you have something there, I think is kind of a con, because you don't know exactly what you have at the quarterback position. Next con, the secondary does need work. I like Kenny Moore, the corner, a lot, but outside of him, this is an extremely thin secondary group. And I put kind of the same thing as the other con. The thin linebacker core is another concern for me. I wish they would have kind of addressed linebacker and secondary in the draft as well. But those are really kind of nitpicky things. Like I said, if Anthony Richardson plays out to be an elite guy, this could legitimately be an elite team. All that being said, though, for me, the uncertainty of AR, I'm going to go with the Steelers in this one. And you go back to when we played them last year, we were beating them. It just took Mitch Trubisky completely shitting his pants for us to lose that game. So I think the Steelers, they just match up well with the Colts, and AR's not proven yet. I'm going with the Steelers here in a very close one. Could turn into a shootout. That brings us to 3-1. In Week 5, we host the Dallas Cowboys. They had a record of 12-5 last year. They won their division, but obviously lost their first playoff game against the Green Bay Packers, the youngest team in the playoffs last year. And truly one of the most embarrassing playoff performances I've ever seen in my life. When you talk about the hype of the Cowboys last year, probably the thing we talked about the most on this channel outside of the Steelers was me trying to warn you guys about the fool's gold that was Dak Prescott, the fool's gold that was the Dallas Cowboys as an entire organization. But no one wanted to listen. I got called a moron by all the Cowboys fans. Well, look what happened in the playoff game. Dak Prescott completely shit his diaper. I don't think he had a single completion in the first quarter of that game. And their quote-unquote world-class defense got exposed by basically a rookie quarterback and the youngest offense. So, again, I say all that just to, if you weren't a listener last year, that's how I felt about the Cowboys last year. And they were a much more talented team this past year than they were now. I think that this team has gotten drastically worse. We're going to talk about that in the cons. This is the only team where I actually listed 4 cons. I tried to keep it to 3, but I have a lot of gripes with the Cowboys. And it's not that I'm trying to pick on the Cowboys. I think I'm just being realistic. These are actually real problems with the Dallas Cowboys. But let's first talk about their pros. I only was able to find 2 big pros for the Cowboys. They still have incredible high-end talent. They definitely do have that, because Micah Parsons, I think, is easily a top 5 defensive player in the world right now. I don't even think that that's arguable. I think he has multiple defensive player of the years in his future. His ability to in coverage and as just a pure pass rusher. The guy's a monster. I don't need to sell you guys on Micah Parsons. That guy is a freak. And also CeeDee Lamb. And CeeDee Lamb was one of the few predictions that I actually got right last year going into the year. One of my bold takes was CeeDee Lamb is going to go from a good player to a household name last year, and that's exactly what happened, because he had by far and away the best year of his career. And now I think you can honestly make a legitimate argument that CeeDee Lamb is the second best receiver in football. I still think Tyreek Hill is number 1. But if you want to argue me for CD at number 2, I have no gripes with that. Just in terms of the overall complete skill of the guy, he's an absolute freak. So those 2 players alone, I don't know where you'd rank them out, but those 2 guys probably would be on a list of the top 30 players in the NFL. That's how good those 2 guys are. So I do give them credit for having those guys, because those 2 guys can change any given game. They're both that good. Another pro I have here is Trayvon Diggs will make his return. And even though I have my problems with Trayvon Diggs as a player, he's obviously still widely talented. He's still an all-pro level guy when he's healthy. I just think he's slightly overrated, and especially in terms of man-to-man coverage. I think he gets burned a lot, which we're going to talk about. If you look over in the cons, I have listed secondary concerns. So we're going to talk about my kind of issues with Diggs. But I can't deny the talent he brings to the table, especially. So I'm going to give them credit. Obviously, I'm going to count that as a pro, him coming back. But let's get into the cons. Let's get into my issues with this Cowboys team and why I think the Steelers are going to win, is because I think last year, I already had my issues with this Cowboys team. They won 12 games, and I think that they only beat one team, or I think they beat two teams last year with a record above 500. That was Miami, and that was Philly, whenever Philly was imploding. So last year, that's why I was like telling you guys they're fool's gold. Anytime they play a big game against a real playoff team, they usually collapse. And so I think that was proven in the playoffs. And you take all my problems with them last year, they were able to win 12 games. Now I think that they're just simply a worse team. I think that they downgraded their team, and there's a world that exists where this Cowboys team wins like 8 or 9 games. I could realistically see that because the division got better. Philly's a lot better. I think they're going to be a lot better. We're going to talk about them obviously later down in this video, but the first con I have for the Cowboys is Ezekiel Elliott is now the clear number one running back. He's no longer, whenever he was in Dallas before, he was in a tandem with Tony Pollard, and they were kind of able to complement each other pretty well. That's why Tony Pollard looked so good as a number 2 back. Obviously disappointed as the number 1, but I still think you are doing a massive downgrade going from Tony Pollard as your full-time guy to Zeke, because Zeke had by far and away his worst year in New England. You talk about the fumbles. I don't know how committed he is to blocking as well, which is really important now as the game goes on. So Zeke, I don't know. I'm not sure if Ezekiel Elliott is talented enough at this point in his career to be a full-time number 1 starting running back for an NFL team. And I think that the Dallas Cowboys even kind of acknowledged that. That's why they shipped his ass out, the previous year. That's why they cut him. So I think that they were honestly just kind of desperate, because if they hadn't signed Zeke, then their running back core would have been like Rico Dowdle and like Deuce Vaughn, who's like 4 feet tall. So it's like you kind of were in a desperate situation. I still think there were a handful of names out there that you could have done, but Zeke, obviously being a former Cowboy, Jerry wanting to take care of his guys, probably just couldn't pass up on that. So Zeke, that's a big concern for me, because I don't think he's a starting number 1 NFL running back in today's game. And I kind of put a slash here, Dak's reliance on the run game. He's had basically an elite run game or an above-average run game for his entire career. And if you go look at the statistics of when Dak Prescott does not get over 100 rushing yards from his run game, he wins about 30% of his games. So he's always been heavily reliant on the running back position. And now, like I've said, with them downgrading so much at running back, with Zeke being the full-time guy, and I don't think you can realistically depend on him over a season. If Dak doesn't get 100-plus yards from his running back, he wins 30% of his games. So that's a major red flag right there. Another thing that kind of goes into that is this is by far Dak's worst offensive line. A signature of the Cowboys in the Dak Prescott era was always their offensive line. It was incredible. It was the best one in the league whenever he came in as a rookie, and definitely aged out, guys retired, guys got older, but it was still always really good. This is now by far the worst offensive line Dak Prescott will play behind in his entire career. So you combine that with the fact that he won't have a consistent run game. This could be a massive downslide for Dak in terms of his production. So my secondary concerns. I get it. A lot of people like their secondary still, even though they lost Gilly, which I'm going to get into here in the next one, but Trevon Diggs and Deron Bland. I feel like they are basically a carbon copy of each other. They're basically identically the same player in terms of how they play the game, because both in man-to-man get exposed, but they both make flashy plays. They both they get the interceptions. Deron Bland led the league in interceptions last year. I'm pretty sure Trevon Diggs did lead the league in interceptions as well. One of the years prior. So they're both flashy guys. They're both playmakers. But in terms of man-to-man coverage, especially in playoff games, they get burnt. So that worries me a lot whenever you have basically carbon copy, the same 2 guys who are both getting exposed in man-to-man coverage. That worries me for their secondary. And we can go into the last bullet point I have here is the loss of Dan Quinn, I think, is going to be felt immediately. And I know they replaced him with Mike Zimmer. I don't really know how to feel about that. Mike Zimmer's been out of a job for years now. I kind of liked him in Minnesota, but I think no matter how you slice it, even the most optimistic viewpoint of Mike Zimmer, it's still a downgrade from Dan Quinn, who I think last year was by far the best defensive coordinator in football. He was basically a second head coach on the team last year because Mike McCarthy didn't even attend defensive meetings. He said, I'm just going to worry about the offense. Dan, you can run the defense however you want. So Dan Quinn was essentially like a second head coach. He had full reign over the defense, and losing that guy, not only in terms of his leadership gone, but also the scheme he brought, his philosophy, all that's now gone. So that worries me a lot for Dallas, losing that guy, and then also losing Gilly. Stephon Gilmore, I think, and I'll argue with anyone down in the comments, is Stephon Gilmore was their best secondary player last year. You can tell me Deron Bland all you want, but in terms of man-to-man shutdown coverage, what you want from a corner in today's game, I think Gilmore was still their best guy. And I would have taken Stephon Gilmore right now over Diggs or Bland. And so they lost him. That's a massive loss for me. So all those issues I have with Dallas, it really comes down to what I said. I had problems with them last year, and they were a much more talented team last year. And now I feel like they've made significant downgrades to their roster, and I think the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to be able to take advantage of that, especially being at home. So the Steelers get the win here and advance to 4-1. In Week 6, we fly out to Vegas to play the Raiders again. We played them in Vegas last year. Kind of a weird scheduling thing because I don't remember the last time we played a out-of-division opponent back-to-back years in the same stadium. That's kind of a weird thing. But the Raiders obviously had an 8-9 season last year. They got off to a god-awful start. Jimmy Garoppolo was a fledgling disaster there, and so was the coach Josh McDaniels, who was fired, obviously. I think that was... I want to say around Halloween. I think the day after Halloween, November the 1st, was whenever they cleaned house with the Raiders. They got rid of, I think the GM got fired and their head coach got fired, and they benched Jimmy G. They were like, this start to the year was that big of a fucking disaster. We're just completely cleaning house. And Antonio Pierce obviously stepped up, and that's why he's the first pro for me. He's obviously a significant upgrade over Josh McDaniels, who clearly just shouldn't be a head coach in the NFL. I don't think he's ever going to get an opportunity as a head coach ever again. Even if let's say he gets an OC job and just kills it, I don't think he will ever get a head coaching job ever again, just because the 2 times he was given the chance, it was a flat-out disaster. And he probably should have been fired after his first year, but it came out the owner didn't have enough money to fire him after his first year. So Pierce, not only from a winning standpoint, they won a lot more games. They actually had an above 500 record after Pierce took over, but also on top of that, I feel like he actually built a culture in short order in Vegas, like where there really didn't feel like a direction for the team under McDaniels. Well, Pierce, I feel like instantly came in and implemented that culture of, like toughness. We're going to beat you up and really rely on our stars. Our next big pro for the Raiders I have is they signed Christian Wilkins away from the Miami Dolphins, who's a really high-end productive player at the age of 25. He's just entering his prime years. You got him signed up for the next 4 years, so you're getting the prime years of Christian Wilkins, who last year put up double-digit sacks with the Miami Dolphins, coming off a career year. I think that is incredible. You're pairing him with Max Crosby. Obviously, the Chandler Jones thing didn't work out. I don't know what the fuck happened to Christian Jones. Chandler Jones, sorry. Yeah, Chandler Jones. Because whenever he was brought in, he was viewed as like, oh, this is going to be Max Crosby's like running mate. They're going to like be a 1-2 destructive force on the defensive line, and it just didn't work out. Chandler Jones was not good at all with the Raiders, and now you got Christian Wilkins. Like I said, he's entering his prime years, so to just put another crazy, unstoppable force on the line with Crosby is only going to elevate the both of them. And then the last one I put is they do have some really good high-end talent on this team. Now, they have some holes like we're going to get into with their cons, but at some like really important positions, they have some tremendous players. Like we just said, Wilkins they just got, who is going to be at minimum a Pro Bowl level defensive tackle for them. Max Crosby is easily a top 10 defensive player in football right now. Davante Adams, I will still argue with anybody that Davante Adams is still a top 5 receiver in football. The fact that he put up the numbers he did last year, still cracking over 1,000 yards with one of the worst quarterback situations in the NFL last year with Jimmy Garoppolo and Aiden O'Connell. the guy still balled out. So, if you just gave him like a mid-tier quarterback, let's say you just gave him like I don't know, who's like the 16th best quarterback in the NFL? Off the top of my head, I don't know. Let's just throw a name out there, like Kirk Cousins. Kirk is better than that, but if he had someone like that, I think people would still widely regard him like that. But for me, I still think from a talent perspective, Davante Adams is still a top 5 guy at his position. And their draft, they did get Brock Bowers as well, and Brock Bowers has the potential to be one of the best tight ends in the NFL. He's one of the most hyped tight end prospects. I think since I've been watching football, Brock Bowers might be the most hyped up tight end prospect. You could say Kyle Pitts maybe, but I feel like Brock Bowers is even viewed as a higher prospect than Kyle Pitts. Even though he went lower in his draft, it was just a different circumstance. So let's take a look at the cons for the Raiders. So the first one, the glaring one, is they lost Josh Jacobs, which you could argue was their most important offensive player over the past couple of years. He led the league in rushing 2 seasons ago and has been a perennial 1,000-yard guy, was a rookie of the year, has been really the heartbeat of that offense. And I think he's easily a top 3 guy. I think when you talk about the top 3 running backs, I'd probably say top 5, because for me, the top 3 probably go something like McCaffrey, Saquon, Derrick Henry, and then Josh Jacobs would be kind of right there in that range. So losing that guy for nothing really sucks. But it's clear the Raiders didn't want to pay him. They were not willing to commit to him. So for Jacobs, it's like, yeah, I 100% get you leaving. You definitely went to a better situation in Green Bay. If I'm the Raiders, especially whenever we don't have a solidified quarterback, I don't really get what the hesitancy is to not pay Josh Jacobs. I know it's not a trendy thing to pay running backs in the NFL right now, but whenever you have such uncertainty at the quarterback position, why wouldn't you just keep, arguably your best offensive player around? And the uncertainty at quarterback is what I have listed here for my next con, is Gardner Minshew without Shane Steichen is what? You have to go back to his Jacksonville days, which are wildly inconsistent. And obviously he had his best year with Shane Steichen. I think really any quarterback in the NFL, if they play with Shane Steichen as their play caller, is going to have their best year. He's just that good. I think of him as the McVay, the Shanahan 2.0. That's how highly I think of Shane Steichen. So, of course he looked good in Shane Steichen's system, but is he going to be able to recreate that without Shane Steichen? I think the odds are against that. So you're probably getting, not probably, you more than likely are getting a significantly worse version of Gardner Minshew this year. I'm glad that they brought him in because he's definitely an upgrade over Aiden O'Connell, but I don't know. To see him outside of Steichen's system, I got to see it before I believe it with that, for them to really be competitive with that guy. And then lastly, they didn't address their secondary really in the draft. I mean, they did in the later rounds, but I wanted to see them use one of their first or second round picks on secondary, because for me, you could argue outside of the quarterback position, secondary is probably their biggest glaring hole. And like I said, they went with Brock Bowers, which I think they simply thought, we're going to take the best available player here. And that's what they did with Brock Bowers. But for me, I feel like tight end was not really a position of need. You already drafted Michael Mayer, I think, last year in the second round. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But you already have Michael Mayer. Now, Brock Bowers, I think, is going to be a lot better than Michael Mayer. But Michael Mayer's not a bad player. He's a good, young, ascending player at that position. So it's not like tight end was a big glaring need. So for me, I think it would have made a lot more sense to go with one of those corners or even trade down if you could have. Because where they picked at 13, they could have had any of the corners. They could have had Quinyon, they could have had Terrion Arnold, they could have had whoever. And it came out from Terrion Arnold. He said the Raiders called him and actually flipped a coin between if picking him and Brock Bowers. Again, I don't want to sound like I'm hating on the pick of Brock Bowers, but just from a team building standpoint, I feel like corner would have made a ton more sense for them. And they didn't even address it in the second round, and I actually liked their second round pick of Jackson Powers Johnson. But again, I wanted to see them invest high-end draft capital in that secondary, and they just didn't do that. I think they have a very lackluster unit in their secondary. So all that being said, I do think the Steelers are going to come out with a win in this one. You look at the matchup last year, we beat them in Vegas, and now I think we have a significantly better all-around roster and healthier team right now. I think we're going to beat the Raiders again. That puts us up to 5-1. In Week 7, we come back to Pittsburgh to host the New York Jets. They had a record of 7-10 last year, obviously due to Aaron Rodgers getting injured on the 4th play of their entire season last year. And I'm going to make a video before next season starts about my most intriguing teams entering this year. And spoiler alert, the Jets are probably going to be like number 1 or number 2 on that list. And let's get into why, because I think that they could be good. I think that they could be bad. Let's talk about it. The pros. Obviously, Aaron Rodgers returns. You can't even really put into words how big of an upgrade he is over Zach Wilson. And I get it. Zach Wilson had a couple moments here and there, but throughout the course of the season showed you he's not really an NFL-level guy. I don't think so, especially in this Jets system. And he's now gone. I think he's in Denver now. But Aaron Rodgers, we're going to talk about some of the issues I have with Aaron and the cons you can see over there, but automatically an upgrade. Even if you're getting like a worse version of the last time we saw healthy Aaron, it's still a significant upgrade over Zach Wilson by a mile. So obviously that's the biggest pro with them, is they're getting Aaron Rodgers back. The next big pro I have for them is they have a Super Bowl caliber defense. Their defense in a couple games looked like it could be the best defense in the NFL. Like, it is that level of a defense. Their secondary is stellar. Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed. And then the pass rushers they have is incredible, and they added to that now by adding the guy from the Eagles, Hassan Reddick, who is a stud. Hassan Reddick, his couple years in Philly, put up over 10 sacks. I think it was either 2 or 3 seasons he had with the Eagles. He was a Pro Bowl level guy. The year that they got to the Super Bowl just a couple years ago, he was an all-pro level guy. So that was a tremendous get to add to their already incredible defense. So I think the Jets have a legit chance, and I don't think this is hyperbolic to say that the Jets could have the number 1 defense in football this upcoming year. And then my last pro is they did Band-Aid their offensive line. Like, their biggest issue I felt last year going in was their offensive line sucked, and it was by far away going to be the worst offensive line that Aaron ever played behind. But they were able to kind of address it by bringing in Morgan Moses, who's actually hurt right now. I don't even know if he's going to be ready to go by the start of the year, but eventually we'll get Morgan Moses, who when he's healthy is good. And then Tyron Smith, who when he's healthy, he's like a Pro Bowl level guy. And again, he's another guy that struggles with injuries. And then you did draft Olu Fashanu. So that's a really good get for me. Like, I think I said in my first mock draft that if the Jets were able to land Olu Fashanu, that's like their dream scenario. And it actually ended up playing out that way because, I know Joe Alt is widely viewed as like the top tackle prospect, and for good reason. He's a monster. But I still think Fashanu has the chance to be the best O-lineman in this entire class. And obviously it was the biggest position of need for the Jets. They could have went flashy and went Brock Bowers and getting Aaron another weapon. But I think they made the smart move addressing their O-line, which is actually, I think, kind of out of character because the rest of their other offseason moves kind of made it look like they're just all in for the next upcoming year. But drafting Fashanu, who can be your left or right tackle for the next 12 years, feels like more of a long-term move. But I think he's already going to be a really good player with the Jets. Now let's take a look at some of the problems I have with the Jets. And I do kind of have a laundry list of issues with the New York Jets. So starting off, my biggest issue with the Jets, especially as the season goes on, is they have a lot of injury-prone guys on their offense. We just talked about it with their offensive line. As of right now, it's okay. But if Tyron Smith gets injured, which is probably 85% chance of that happening, you're kind of fucked because the left side is now a mess. Morgan Moses, we just talked about, was another one of their big veteran O-line signings. He's hurt right now. He's not even ready to go. He can't even practice in training camp right now. He's hurt right now. Mike Williams was one of their big signings. He just tore his ACL last year and has been made of glass since he's entered the NFL. Breece Hall had a gruesome, I can't remember if it was ACL or Achilles injury in his rookie year, so there's that. And then Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers is 39 years old, which I actually have listed as my second con. You can see here, it kind of plays into that, is coming off that injury at that age, I think is unprecedented. And Aaron Rodgers in his prime did rely on his athleticism, getting out of the pocket and playmaking. I think that's going to be completely gone. That's going to be an aspect of Aaron's game that is just gone. I think he's going to be now just a straight up stand in the pocket, deliver the ball type guy, which that takes away that superstar facet of his game, because that's really what made him so special in Green Bay. Is not only he had the arm, the accuracy, but also his ability to manipulate the pocket, get out, and extend plays. And that, I think that's going to be a big missing piece of his game this year. And like I said, on top of that, his age. He's the oldest quarterback in the NFL right now. He might actually be the oldest player in the NFL. I didn't double check that. And then my last con is Robert Saleh even any fucking good? Like, do we have any real proof to point to if Robert Saleh is a good head coach? I think he's a really good, smart defensive mind. He clearly has gotten the defense in order in New York, but is he a good head coach? I don't know. And I think if you were to just look at his tenure over the past couple of years, I think the evidence would tell you no, he's not a good coach, because the way he managed the quarterback situation last year was a fucking disgrace. Because I get it, Zach Wilson was really disappointed, but the fact that I think his name, let me know if I'm wrong in the comments, Tim Boyle, I'm pretty sure that was the guy's name. The fact that that guy started an NFL game, I don't give a shit what the circumstances are. The fact that Tim Boyle played a game, go back and watch the highlights from that Black Friday game they played against the Miami Dolphins. I think it was honestly the worst performance I've ever seen from an NFL quarterback. Like, honestly, and I just don't know like what to say. Like, the guy was at the 50-yard line and couldn't even get the ball into the end zone. Like, I don't know. For me, that was an utter disaster. Kind of had some scuffles with the media. And it's overall, you just look at his win-loss record, it's bad in New York. And you can talk about, the roster he's had and all that, but he's had a say in building this roster. So this feels like, to me, a big make or break year. I feel like if the Jets don't make the playoffs, which I'm kind of betting on them to not make the playoffs. If they don't make the playoffs, I think the GM's gone. I think the head coach is gone. Aaron might even be gone depending on how he looks. So it's kind of a make or break year. I think they're one of the most intriguing teams. But for me, like I said, I just have too many glaring issues with this team, especially at important positions. So I think the Steelers are going to win this. Puts us up to 6-1. So week 8, we stay in Pittsburgh to host the other New York team, the Giants. They had a record of 6-11 last year. One of the most disappointing teams, honestly, when you look at how good they were in 2022 compared to 2023. I mean, they won a playoff game in 2022, and then this past year was, just a mess. Tommy DeVito was their biggest story. Give me a fucking break. So let's take a look at their pros and cons. I said they have a potentially great defense. I really do think they have that, because last year their defense was actually looking good, and they added Brian Burns, who I think Brian Burns is actually one of the most underrated stars in the NFL. When you go look at his numbers, he's just a sack production machine, and you pair him with the already really good defensive lineman you have there, Dexter Lawrence. So that's one thing the Giants are going to have, is their defense is actually, I think, going to be pretty good, especially their pass rush unit. Another pro, Malik Neighbors. This was a team in desperate need of a playmaker. And before they drafted Malik Neighbors, I was saying that they probably had the worst wide receiver core in football. Now that they drafted Neighbors, I don't think you can say that. I'd probably say New England now has the worst wide receiver core. But it was a team in desperate need of a playmaker, so you definitely added that with Malik Neighbors. And then my final pro is maybe Brian Daboll bounces back, because when you go back to 2022, I had zero expectations for that team, and yet he was able to get them to 9 wins and win a playoff game. So, I know last year sucked, especially for him, because it felt like at one point the locker room was kind of against him. Felt like the coaches kind of hated him. We know what happened with Wink Martindale, their defensive coordinator, who basically just said, I'm not working here, fuck you, and left. So my thing is, it can't really maybe. I struggle to say this, because what I want to say is it can't get much worse than last year. But there actually is a world where it is worse than last year, because you lost Saquon, because I think you could potentially still have a bottom 5 offense in the NFL. But I did list it as a pro as maybe Brian Daboll just bounces back and kind of looks more like that 2022 version, because he is coaching for his job right now. Because if they suck again, he's gone. When we know that the Giants ownership is extremely impatient with head coaches, when you just look at like their last 4 coaches, they get like 2 or 3 years. And if they don't produce, he gets them out of there. Their owner, Mara, gets them out of there. So let's take a look at their cons. Obviously, the number one glaring one, they lost Saquon Barkley, which was really their only productive offensive player last year. And they won 6 games with Saquon. You take him away, I could see maybe like a 3-win team, honestly. I think Saquon was that important to this team. Was really the only productive player on that offense at all last year. And I remember before the season started, I was talking about how it's fucking crazy to me that they decided to pay Daniel Jones instead of Saquon. And this was the year after they made the playoffs. They beat the Vikings. I had all the Giants fans, because we covered that Saquon saga a lot. That was one of the big things, early on the channel we talked about a lot, was the whole Saquon contract dispute. And I had a lot of Giants fans telling me, you're a fucking idiot. Saquon wasn't that important to the 2022 run or whatever. Like, Daniel Jones actually deserved that. Well, look now. Would you rather have Daniel Jones or Saquon Barkley? Because I don't even think that one's remotely close. And that brings us to my next point, which kind of relates to that, is Daniel Jones is on the worst contract in the NFL. If he's not on the worst, then he's on a short list of like 3 guys that are on the worst contract in football right now, because I think obviously one way to measure how bad a contract is, well, would any other team in the NFL give him that exact same contract right now? Obviously not. There's not a single team in the NFL that would give Daniel Jones that contract. You go look at the year Daniel Jones had that earned him that contract, throwing 15 touchdowns. What the fuck was that management thinking, giving him that? And I always say, when I talk about this, is Brian Daboll, no matter what happens, no matter if he never coaches again, he gets fired after this year, he will always be able to say, I made Daniel Jones look so good that he got paid $40 million. Like, that is such a crowning achievement to me that Daniel Jones ever got that contract. And I think he actually made more money last year than Lamar Jackson, to just put that in perspective, how fucking stupid that is. So, and then, like I said at the bottom there, potentially bottom 5, excuse me, potentially bottom 5 defense, yeah. I still think it can be that bad, because Daniel Jones sucks. He's not good. You lost your only productive player in Saquon, and outside of Malik Neighbors, I like some of their guys, but like no one really, to me, feels like a strong, consistent option. Their O-line has been kind of a mess for years now. Even though I like some of the personnel on that line, it just feels like they're never able to put that line together. So I think the Giants are going to be a bottom feeder next year. It'd be kind of embarrassing if we lost to them. And I talked about this last year with the Steelers when we did that schedule breakdown. We played Houston and we played Arizona. And before the season started, those were viewed as the 2 worst teams. And I said, well, if the Steelers lose to either of those teams, I have to do something fucking drastic on the channel. And it turned out they lost to both of them. Now, it turned out Houston was actually a lot better than we'd thought. But this is the team this year. If they lose to the Giants, you guys are going to have to let me know down in the comments something fucking crazy I can do, because it would be an embarrassment to the franchise to lose to this bad of a team. I think this is pretty easily the worst team we play in the entire year. So if we lose to the Giants, I don't know what I'm going to do, but that brings the Steelers to 7-1. So week 9, the Steelers have a bye. So we jump to week 10, where we go down to Washington to play the Commanders. They had a record of 4-13 last year. Well, I think they're going to be a lot better this year. I think they're actually going to be an under-the-radar team to, I don't know if a wild card spot is realistic, but to maybe win like 8 games out of nowhere. I think the Commanders are going to be much more improved. Let's take a look at some of the reasons why I think the Commanders are going to be better. Well, first off, a completely new regime in Washington. I mean, you talk about new owner, new GM, new head coach. They completely cleaned house. They really getting the stink of Dan Snyder off them, and I think Dan Snyder is truly one of the worst owners in professional American sports history. So to get that fucking moron out of there, that's obviously right there. That's a massive upgrade. And I really like their GM, Adam Peters. I think he has potential to be a really good GM. He's smart. He's innovative. So I like their GM hire there. Head coach is kind of take it or leave it. I think Dan Quinn really should just still be a defensive coordinator in today's NFL, but we're going to talk about that when we get to the cons. But overall, a completely new regime starting over in terms of the management, in terms of who's running this team, is a massive upgrade over the previous regime. Next one I put is the upside of Jaden Daniels. If you guys have listened to my mock drafts and all that, you know that I'm extremely high on Jaden Daniels. I just think he has the physical attributes to work in the NFL. And he's one of the guys that I would honestly be shocked if he didn't work in the NFL, because he has the explosive athleticism and the throwing ability. You know, his numbers at LSU this past year were comparable to 2019 Joe Burrow. And 2019 Joe Burrow is usually regarded as one of the best quarterback seasons in the history of college football. So Jaden Daniels actually kind of rivaled that in terms of his numbers. Obviously, he won the Heisman. I think he's just going to work out. I think he's electrifying. I think he's going to be insane. And then my next pro, they had some really good veteran signings. Austin Eckler, who was really like the clear number one guy in LA. Well, now he's going to be running in a tandem with Brian Robinson. Brian Robinson's really one of the most underrated running backs in the NFL. So I like Eckler more in that role of in a tandem as opposed to being like the lead guy. And then Bobby Wagner, I think that's one of the most underrated signings of the entire free agency period, because Bobby Wagner, in my opinion, is still one of the best linebackers in football. Washington just kind of snagged him out of nowhere. So I thought that was an incredible signing. Let's take a look at some of their cons. Rookie quarterback. So yeah, I kind of have Jaden Daniels in a pro and a con, but that's really what you get when you draft a rookie quarterback. It's like, because the upside, you can be optimistic about it, but at the same time, it's uncertain. We don't know for sure if Jaden Daniels is going to pop. So I did put it in there just for the uncertainty, because we don't really know exactly what we have at this point in time with him as a pro. And that kind of ties into the next point. It's an unproven team. They've had a lot of losing the past couple of years. It's a rebuilding roster. And then the last one is this, I kind of touched on this at the beginning. Is Dan Quinn really that big of an upgrade over Ron Rivera? You know, as I really think they're kind of the same. Now, they might vary in terms of like their play-to-play philosophy, but in terms of the grand scheme of the NFL, for me, they're two guys that just probably shouldn't be head coaches in the modern NFL. Like they're both best suited to be defensive coordinators. They had a lot of success in the past as head coaches. They both made it to Super Bowls and lost. But in 2024, I just don't know if Dan Quinn is the right guy to be a head coach, especially when you have a rookie quarterback. So I just think they could have went with a better signing. It's not a terrible signing. It's not awful like the Gerard Mayo signing, but I just don't think it's much of a needle mover. Like if the plan was to move off Rivera and go to Quinn, for me, in the grand scheme of things, they're kind of the same guy. Like they kind of bring the same stuff to the table. So I don't know how great of an upgrade or how great of a signing that is. But I do actually have us losing to Washington. And again, this is another thing I talked about in last year's schedule breakdown, is the Steelers every year overlook a team. This happens every year, at least once or twice in each season, where there's a team where we're probably favorited by a good bit. Like we're going to be favorited against Washington for sure, unless they like come out insane to start off the year. But if they go the way I'm projecting, the Steelers are probably going to be favorited in this matchup. We're going to kind of be overlooking them, especially when we play Baltimore the next week. And we tend to overlook these type of teams and play down. That's one of my biggest criticisms of Tomlin, is we seem to like play down to competition. So this feels like a team that we just overlook and they beat us. And so that puts us at 7-2. That brings us to week 11, where we play our first in-division game of the season, which makes zero sense. Like, what the fuck were the schedule makers smoking when they made the Steelers schedule? Why do we got to play till fucking week 11 to play a division matchup? That makes zero sense to me whatsoever. But week 11, we do play Baltimore. And I might have said it earlier, but we did sweep Baltimore this past year. We beat them both times we played them. Like kind of the midway through the year, we won with that George Pickens walk-off. That's when that meme of Canada kind of got popular, where he was like being a little bitch in the booth and all sad because that's not the play he called. And And then we beat them the final week of the season. Obviously, they were resting all their guys. And we barely even squeaked by them then, and they were playing like all their backup guys. But let's take a look at the breakdown, the pros. They got the reigning MVP, Lamar Jackson. I mean, it's clear. You can say all you want about Lamar in the playoffs. I think that's a warranted conversation. But regular season MVP Lamar is one of the most physically unstoppable players we've seen in the history of the league. He's a 2-time MVP now. In the regular season, the guy fucking dominates, and there's really no argument against that. Next one, they added Derrick Henry. I mean, I talked about this again in a couple times, but I'll say it again. I think it's going to be the scariest duo in the NFL next year because Derrick Henry has never played with a quarterback at the caliber of Lamar Jackson. The best quarterback Derrick Henry played with was prime Ryan Tannehill, and Ryan Tannehill was a very predictable style of quarterback. He was never going to get out of the pocket. He was always a stand-up, straight in the pocket, deliver the ball type guy. Really couldn't have more of a polar opposite style than Lamar Jackson, who is, like I said, one of the most physically just unbelievable players ever. The dual threat ability has come a long way as a passer, where I now think he's legitimately an elite passer of the football. You put that dual threat ability of Lamar with Derrick Henry with a much better offensive line. Like, people think Derrick Henry's like on his last leg. That's fucking wrong. The guy still rushed for over 1,100 yards last year behind the worst offensive line he's ever had on a dreadful Titans team. So you now put him with Lamar. That 1-2 punch is going to be disgusting. And then my last pro, they have a top 3 roster in the NFL. And you could honestly make the argument they have the best player-for-player roster in the NFL right now. I would be definitely willing to listen to that. I think when it comes to rosters, in no particular order, it's the Chiefs, the Niners, and the Ravens. Those are the top 3 rosters in the NFL right now. And Baltimore might just have the best one. Let's take a look at their cons. They lost Mike McDonald, their defensive coordinator. I think it is going to hurt. It definitely will hurt to lose that guy because Baltimore's defense is undeniable how incredible they looked last year. So I think the loss of him will be felt. It does suck to lose like a stud coordinator, but I think Baltimore has the culture in place. They have the management in place to not let it like drag their entire season down, kind of what happened with the Eagles last year, which we're going to talk about because we do play them in a little bit. And then another con, they lost Patrick Queen, which if it were like any other team in the NFL to lose Patrick Queen, that would be such a detrimental blow to lose that guy for his age, his skill set, his upside. Like, he's entering his peak years right now. But the fact that they have Roquan, I think, kind of negates that because, like, yeah, it's obviously great to have 2 great linebackers, but in terms of, like, the modern-day NFL, it just financially doesn't really make sense to have 2 high-end linebackers that you're paying big money to. And clearly Roquan was the better one. They kept him. So, yeah, it sucks to lose Patrick Queen, especially to us, of all teams, to lose it to their biggest rival, the Steelers. It definitely stings. He was a homegrown guy. But the fact that you have Roquan, I think, kind of makes up for that. But I'm going to give you guys a spoiler here as to my predictions. I have them sweeping us this year. Like I said, we swept them last year. I think unless they're resting their guys again by the next time we play them, they're going to sweep us this year. In terms of talent, the Pittsburgh Steelers have zero business beating the Baltimore Ravens. Like I said, in terms of rosters, this is one of the greatest rosters in the league right now. And I get it. They're always physical, close games, these division matchups. But I really think that the Derrick Henry signing just unlocks an element of this team that we've never seen. And for me, this feels like the year the Ravens will win the Super Bowl. You know, it's hard to say that because how dominant the Chiefs are and Lamar kind of underwhelming in the playoffs. But that signing to me, I feel like really it's unprecedented. Like, I don't think people really quite understand how insane that signing is. So I have them beating us here. I think they're going to beat us later in the year as well. But for now, that puts us at 7-3. Week 12 is our first matchup with the Cleveland Browns. We're going out to Cleveland to play them. So we won 1 last year. They won 1. I think we beat, I want to say that was week 2 of last year. It was on Monday Night Football. We beat them. Deshaun Watson completely shit his pants in the clutch of that game. I vividly remember it. He was just terrible in that game. And then the later one I want to say like midway through the year. It was one of Canada's last games. That might have been Matt Canada's last game as the coordinator last year, was that second game against the Browns where Warren went off, but we lost. So this year, I actually have the Steelers sweeping the Browns, the opposite of the Ravens. I think we're going to sweep the Browns. I think the Browns, and people are going to think I'm saying this just because of like a Steeler bias or whatever, but people are going to think that. I think the Browns are actually going to be kind of bad this year, and we're going to get into all that with my cons list here. But let's take a look at the arguments for them being good, because, again, when I said about the Jets, when I talked about that list of like the most intriguing teams, the Browns are definitely on that list. And I think it really comes down to the Jets or the Browns in terms of teams that are the most intriguing. So let's look at the pros. They had the number one defense last year, especially their pass. I don't know. I didn't check in terms of overall defense. I'm pretty sure they were number one in that. Again, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that in the comments, but I know for sure they had the number one pass defense in the NFL. So defense, of course, is incredible. You have the reigning defensive player of the year, Myles Garrett. As much as I disagree with it, it happened. So you got all that in place. Incredible defense. Like, that defense alone will win you games. Nick Chubb returns. You know, he only played like a game and a half last year. Obviously, he had that gruesome injury against us in that same game I just referenced. So he's going to be back. I don't know how much of a step he'll miss after that injury, but when fully healthy, was widely regarded as a top 3 running back in the entire league. And then the last pro I have is Stefanski's offensive wizardry. Cannot be denied. You know, the guy is just able to plug and play players and fucking win games. And we talk about this a lot, but 5 starting quarterbacks last year. 5 starting quarterbacks last year, and they still won 11 games. That is unprecedented. I think that's, like, I didn't do research on it, but I'm confident in saying that that has never happened in the NFL before. To have that much uncertainty and just such a mess going on at the most important position, yet you're still able to make the playoffs, just shows the ridiculous talent that Kevin Stefanski has as a play caller. That guy knows what he's doing, and he's already a 2-time coach of the year. He's only coached 4 years, but he has 2 of them. So let's get into some of my cons. Deshaun Watson flat out is not good. And I think at this point, I think you're just naive if you're arguing that Deshaun Watson is a good NFL player, because we are now 4 years removed from the guy they paid him to be. We're talking about the 2020 season was the last time we saw Deshaun Watson play at an elite level. We're 4 years removed from that. In NFL terms, that is insane, you know, because has he ever had a good game in a Cleveland Browns uniform? I don't really think so. He had one decent half against the Ravens, then he got injured. The guy's not good anymore. The guy they paid him to be is no longer there. And like I said, it's just naive to think that he is that or he ever will be that. And I think it's another point of it is not only is the talent regressed, but there's also a real argument to be made is, does he even give a shit about football anymore? Like, does he really care? Just from his body language and his attitude, it seems like he just doesn't even really give a shit about football. You know, he's like, I got 200 M's in the bank. Why do I give a fuck about football? And it would be hard to blame him. Like, put yourself in that situation. You got that much money. Do you want to go out there and get hit all the time? No. So I kind of get it, but also whenever you're investing that much in a guy to be the leader of your franchise and he's just that low class of a guy, I just don't know. I don't know what Deshaun, I think, like I said, at this point, I think it's just kind of naive to really expect anything from him. The next con I have is their year-to-year inconsistency. And that's been the story of the Browns over the Stefanski era. As much as I like Kevin Stefanski, you look at his track record there, half the years they're good, half the years they suck. You know, his first year there, they were really good. They won a playoff game against us. They shit on us. Baker had an incredible year that year. That was really Baker's coming out party. That was really Baker's one good year, a long-term sustained year in Cleveland. The next year, Baker played hurt. They sucked that year, and they missed the playoffs. That was 21. Then 22, 2 years ago, that was the year Deshaun was traded there, but he didn't play until the last 5 games. They sucked that year. And then this past year, they won 11 games. So there's a lot of inconsistency in terms of they're good, they're bad, they're good, they're bad. And then my last one is and I kind of just touched on this a little bit ago, but the quarterback situation they had last year is unsustainable. To play 5 guys and expect to win like that, for me, that feels like such an anomaly. Like I said, I don't think that's ever happened in the history of the league. So, and there's not a Joe Flacco just sitting out there to like come in and save the day. Like they kind of struck gold there with finding Flacco to just come in and really win them games. So Deshaun is so unreliable, and the quarterback position is such in jeopardy for me to really think the Browns are going to be that good this year. And like I said, what they did last year with the 5 quarterbacks starting doesn't feel repeatable in my opinion. So I think the Browns, I don't think they're going to be very good, and it just comes down to the quarterback. In Week 13, we go to Cincinnati to play the Bengals for the first time of the season. They had a record of 9-8 last year, and were truly one of my most disappointing teams last year. If you listen to me before the season started last year, the Bengals were my number 1 team in my power rankings going into last season. That's how highly I thought of the Cincinnati Bengals. And obviously the Joe Burrow injury happened, but even before that happened, they got off to a terrible start. Week 1, they got bludgeoned by the Cleveland Browns, and they just had a rough time of really putting together a consistent performance week in and week out, and really didn't start until really that Cardinals game. And then they had probably their best game of the year was against the 49ers, where they pummeled the 49ers, and their defense really stepped up. Brock Purdy looked bad in that game. That just showed that their defense actually is still pretty good. So the Bengals, for me, they still have incredible upside. Let's take a look at their pros. Obviously, Joe Burrow returns off the injury. As good as Jake Browning was, as much as he impressed me as the backup, doesn't compare to Joe Burrow. And I will argue this with anybody. I still think Joe Burrow is the second best quarterback in the NFL. The NFL. You can tell me Josh Allen, you can tell me Lamar Jackson, whatever, but Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson have never defeated Patrick Mahomes in the playoffs. That's something Joe Burrow has done. Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, again, both those guys have never been to a Super Bowl. Joe Burrow was, and it was a play away from winning that Super Bowl against the Rams. So Joe Burrow, when fully healthy, I think is only second in the entire league to Patrick Mahomes. Let's take a look at the next pro. The Burrow-Chase connection for me can single-handedly win you games. That's how highly I think of them. I think outside of Mahomes and Kelsey, they're the best 1-2 punch in the entire league. Just go look at all the countless great games they had, especially that Super Bowl run in the playoffs where they were just carving teams up. And my last pro is they definitely upgraded their offensive line, bringing in Trent Brown to really pair with Orlando Brown. So now they have 2 extremely massive tackles to also go with the guy they drafted in Amarius Mims. So that has really been the number 1 issue of the entire Joe Burrow era, has been that offensive line. They never really seem to be able to get that right, but it's not for a lack of trying. It really isn't, because they tried with Orlando Brown, and now this year they went out and got Trent Brown, who was the Patriots' best O-lineman. So their O-line, I think, should be vastly improved. Let's take a look at their cons. So obviously you have the most obvious one. You have the T. Higgins and Trey Hendrickson trade request. We know T. Higgins, there's probably like 10 teams right now in the NFL where T. Higgins would be the number 1 option on those teams. So we know how incredible he is. We know how vital he is to the Bengals offense. So if you take him off this team, I think it drastically, lowers the ceiling of the Bengals offense. And then Trey Hendrickson, I think you can make a strong argument, is their best defensive player. I think he's been their lead pass rusher. So the fact that those 2 guys, if you're just ranking out the top 5 players on the Bengals, T. Higgins and Trey Hendrickson, I think would both be on that list. So if 2 of your top 5 players have both publicly announced to the world that they don't want to be on your team anymore, there's a problem with that. It's one thing to have like internal disputes and all that and have disagreements over contracts, but to come out and publicly announce, hey, I don't want to be here. And I think T. Higgins has even done it twice now. I think he's done 2 separate trade requests. That's weird to me, where your best players, it looks like they just don't even want to be a part of your organization anymore. My next con, you lost Joe Mixon. That is a massive loss that is going to take years, I think, to recover from that, because Joe Mixon has been one of the most consistent run threats in the entire league for years now. Has placed in the top 5 for rushing yards a couple times in his career, so to lose that guy, you replace him with Zach Moss, who's a decent player, but he's nowhere near the upside of Joe Mixon. So I get it. It's not a trendy thing. We talked about this all throughout this video. It's not a trendy thing to pay running back, but Joe Mixon, for me, I got to see how that really impacts this offense, because we talk about the pass game and all that, but Joe Mixon, I feel like, was the unsung hero of this Bengals offense. And let's take a look at my last con. They didn't use their first-round pick on a win-now player, and I don't think I'm the only one out there who considers the Bengals a contender. I think, if you were to ask the 31 other GMs in the NFL, do you consider right now the Cincinnati Bengals a Super Bowl threat? I think well over, a majority would say yes. So I'm not this isn't just me. I think a lot of smart NFL people consider the Bengals to be a contending team because they were just in the fucking Super Bowl 3 years ago. So all that being said, I thought the best case scenario for them would be to draft a win-now player, whereas Amarius Mims, the guy they did draft at 18, for me feels like a project. And maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he just comes in and is day one a monster, but only really had about 10 games of film at Georgia where he looked really good. Outside of that, it's kind of up in the air. So for me, if I was running the Bengals, and my window is this season basically, because let's just say T. Higgins sticks around. I felt like he would have been traded if he was going to be traded. I felt like it would have been before the draft. So this is probably T. Higgins' last year with the Bengals. Trey Hendrickson, probably his last year with the Bengals. For me, this feels like the year you should go all in on this team. And for me, you should have drafted a win-now player in the draft. And they decided to go with the guy with the high upside, but is kind of a project at this moment. So for me, I felt like that was kind of a bad decision for their team, at least in the short term. So my prediction for this, like I said earlier, I have us splitting with the Bengals in this particular game. It's in Cincinnati, so I'm going to give this one to the Bengals. That puts us at 8-4. Week 14, we come back to Pittsburgh to host the Cleveland Browns. And like I said earlier, I have us sweeping the Browns, so I don't want to talk about that too much because I already laid out all my points on that. But I do want to come back to an earlier point is, what the fuck were these people who made the Steelers schedule smoking? Because over a 3-week period, we play the Browns twice. What the fuck were they thinking? I've never seen a schedule this fucked up in my entire life. This is going to be my 9th season watching the NFL. I've never seen this misconstrued and just thrown together of a schedule ever. What is this? Week 15, we have the Battle of PA. We go over to Philadelphia to play the Eagles. They had a record of 11-6 last year. They had that catastrophic self-implosion last year and lost to the Buccaneers in the wild card round of the playoffs. But I think they're going to be vastly improved this year. Let's take a look at their pros. Number one, they heavily addressed their secondary in the draft, doubling down on Quinyon Mitchell in the first round and then Cooper DeJean in the second round is incredible. I got to give the credit to Howie Roseman. I think he's the best general manager in football to be so aggressive in addressing your number one position of need. They wanted Quinyon Mitchell. There was even rumors that they wanted to trade up to take Quinyon Mitchell. They didn't even have to trade up to get him. They got him right where they were. And to get Cooper DeJean, who I think was easily a first-round talent, to get him in the second round and double down on your just depleted secondary is a badass move, honestly. And it's clear your guys last year, I think their secondary was clearly the biggest issue with their roster last season. With big play Slay, I still like Darius Slay a lot, but I don't think he can no longer, over the course of a season, guard the other team's best receiver. I think those days are long behind him. I still think he can be good, he can be useful, but he's no longer a number one corner on a play-to-play instance. And James Bradbury is just toast. And Kevin Byard was a disappointment. He didn't work out the mid-season trade. The next big pro added Saquon Barkley. I'm not even going to expand on that. Saquon Barkley's an Eagle. I guess I will say one thing is this. Saquon Barkley could get less touches with the Eagles this year, but still have more touchdowns and more yards. Because you look at the Giants team, he was the only productive offensive player on that team last year. Every opposing defense knew the ball's going in Saquon's hands. Now you put him with all the playmakers on this team with by far and away the best offensive line he's ever played behind. Saquon Barkley is poised for a monster season. And then my last pro here is new coordinators, which was a must for this team. The coordinators for me Outside of the secondary, that was the biggest problem with the roster. But in terms of like the structure of the Philadelphia Eagles franchise, the offensive and defensive coordinators last year, for me, were the biggest reason as to why the Eagles had that self-implosion. Because Nick Sirianni, as we're going to get to in the cons, doesn't do anything in terms of a play-to-play management. So you really have to rely on your coordinators. And when you had guys who were just simply in over their heads last year, like early in the year, they were kind of able to cover it up. But as the year went on, teams kind of figured out what they were doing. They were a lot more predictable, and they imploded. So this brings me to, I think that they massively upgraded a coordinator. Kellen Moore, is he a perfect guy to OC? No, but he's got some experience. He's had some success in the past. And Vic Fangio, widely regarded as a top 5 defensive coordinator in the NFL. So you got both those guys. Let's take a look at the cons. Number one glaring problem for this team for me is you still have Nick Sirianni. Why? Why the fuck is Nick Sirianni still employed in the NFL? For me, the hire never made sense. The only reason they got to the Super Bowl with him as a head coach is because you had a head coach at offensive coordinator with Shane Steichen, who's now the Colts head coach, who was running their offense, who was essentially he was the offensive play caller on their Super Bowl run. If they just had some random offensive coordinator that year, there would have been no Super Bowl run. So if the argument for Sirianni is, he's been to a Super Bowl as a head coach, so we can't fire him. Like, no. The only reason you made is because Steichen was calling the plays instead of Sirianni. For me, Sirianni is an overglorified cheerleader for the Philadelphia Eagles. He doesn't call defensive plays. He doesn't call offensive plays. He doesn't manage the personnel of the team. So what the fuck does Nick Sirianni do for the Philadelphia Eagles? In my opinion, should have been fired after that implosion. You should have just cleaned house. You got rid of the 2 coordinators. You should have got rid of the head coach as well. You had guys like, this guy named Bill Belichick out there. Oh my God, imagine him with this defense. You had Mike Vrabel out there. Like, they were clear names. It's like one thing to say, yeah, we could have fired him, but there was no one to hire there. There was Bill fucking Belichick out there to hire as head coach. Let's take a look at the next con. Could the implosion spill over into next year? I have my theories about the implosion that happened last year, but that's all they are. They're theories. That doesn't change the fact that what we saw from the Eagles, they finished off their last 6 games. They lost all of their last 6 games. 5 in the regular season and the playoff game against the Buccaneers. Their last 6 games, L's. What if that just spills over into next year? Like, I'm really optimistic. I like the new coordinators. Obviously, Saquon is a massive get. But what if this all just stems from Sirianni doesn't know what the fuck he's doing? It's completely poorly managed from a coaching standpoint, and it self-implodes. Again, what if they start off 1-3? You're telling me Philly isn't going to be coming for Sirianni's head, and they're just going to blow up? It could happen. I think it's unlikely. Like I said, I like the moves they made in the offseason despite Sirianni. But that mess could just spill over. And then my last one is just an unfortunate thing for the Eagles, is 2 real leaders of their locker room. The leader probably of the defense in the locker room for over a decade now, Fletcher Cox. And on the offensive side, Jason Kelce. We're talking about 2 Hall of Famers here that are no longer on your team. And Fletcher Cox, from a talent perspective, definitely out of his prime, but just from a leadership standpoint, it sucks to lose that guy. Jason Kelce is still in his prime. Like, Jason Kelce, if he would have stayed in the NFL, is still a top 5 O-lineman in the entire league, still the best center in football, like, still in his prime. So to lose those guys just to retirement is a massive con for me to lose those guys. Like I said, not in terms of their talent, it's there, but also just purely the locker room standpoint, the presence they brought. The culture that those guys, they were really building blocks of that Eagles culture. So to lose them really sucks. But I'm going to say I lean more towards the pros in this. I really think that they addressed their biggest issues of the offseason outside of head coach. So I have the Steelers losing the Battle of PA. That brings us to 9-5. Week 16, we go down to Baltimore to play the Ravens. And like I said earlier, I have them sweeping us this year. I think there's only really 2 scenarios where we beat the Ravens this year. A, Lamar Jackson gets injured, or B, they're resting all their guys by this point in the season. I don't think it's likely by week 16. It could happen. What if they just go undefeated, something stupid like that? But fully healthy, at least all the key players, roster to roster, the Baltimore Ravens are in a different stratosphere. Like I said earlier, the Ravens, you could argue me into saying they have player for player the best roster in the NFL right now. And if you were to ask me where the Steelers roster would rank, and I really like the Steelers roster, but probably like in the 15 range, somewhere around there. So to compare that to potentially the best in the league, it doesn't add up. So I have the Ravens beating us and sweeping us for 2024, the opposite of last year. Week 16, we have the Christmas game where we host the Kansas City Chiefs. I don't think I need to spend too much time on the Chiefs. You guys know what they are. Let's look at the pros real quick. They have the best quarterback and the best head coach in football. Not really a dispute. They're the reigning back-to-back champs. They obviously have the championship pedigree. And I think they will potentially have a top 3 defense last year. I'm pretty sure they placed 5. I could be wrong. Again, you could correct me in the comments. I think they were rated as the 5th best defense last year. I think they have a chance to get even better than that because a lot of their best players outside of Chris Jones on the defense are young guys. So obviously, as time goes on, the younger guys get better. They enter their prime. So I think their defense has a chance to get even better. The cons, they lost L'Jarius Sneed. Even though I said their defense could get better, that's more so as a collective thing. In terms of losing an individual player, L'Jarius Sneed is a massive loss because at least him playing in the Chiefs system, you can't tell me he was not a top 3 corner last year. Now, maybe that changes. When he goes to Tennessee, it's a different system. We know Spags is probably a top 5 defensive coordinator in football. You could argue he's even the best. So maybe he goes to Tennessee and doesn't really look the same in their system because, we've seen that happen. I think the most recent example of that, of like a superstar corner leaving a certain system and going to a new one and just sucking, was J.C. Jackson, because I think that was the 2021 season he had in New England where he was an all-pro and he was rated by the NFL 100, which is voted on by the players as the best cornerback in football, or maybe number 2 behind Ramsey, but he was super high on that list and got all this money from the Chargers and went there, and I know he got hurt, but even before he got hurt, he sucked, and he's never recovered in his career. So I don't think that's going to be the case with Sneed. Maybe it could happen, but like I said, at least in the Chiefs system, one of the best players at that position. And then the other con, the Rashee Rice mess. I mean, I don't really want to spend too much time on this. I try to keep this all about on the field. I don't like talking too much about off the field issues, but the Rashee Rice, it's such an unfortunate event because like this guy has the opportunity of a lifetime. He's already a champion, had a really good rookie year, and now he's just kind of flushing it down the fucking drain, and you just hate to see it because it's so avoidable. But it's a clear thing here now because he's going to get suspended for, I heard 6 games thrown around for the car accident thing, but that was before he punched the reporter or whatever it was in the face. So there's a chance he could honestly get suspended for the entire season. I don't think it's going to be that severe. I mean, you had Deshaun Watson rape 20 people and only got really an 11-game suspension. So maybe they'll be a little more lenient on Rashee Rice. But no matter what way you look at it, the Chiefs, they're the Chiefs. Like I said, they're the back-to-back champs. Best coach, best quarterback. The Steelers have no business beating them. It's going to be fun, though, on Christmas to watch us play them. I hope it's competitive, That's all I hope for as a Steelers fan. I don't have any realistic hope of us beating them. I just hope it's a close game and we kind of stay in it, give them somewhat of a fight. But ultimately, I do have the Chiefs winning this one, and it puts us down to 9-7. So our final game of the year in Week 18, we host the Cincinnati Bengals. I do actually have us winning this one. I messed up on the graphic. It shouldn't say L. It should say W. Now, like I said earlier, I have us splitting with the Bengals, and they could even be resting their guys by this point. If the Bengals are really good, they could honestly be resting their starters just like the Ravens did last year. Now, is 10-7 good enough to get the Steelers into the playoffs and the insane AFC? That's a conversation for another video because I'm going to be putting out my playoff prediction video. But in terms of the schedule breakdown, that's it. What an insane video. I promise you guys, I did not intend on this video being this long. I've never had a video on this channel over an hour. So, wow. If you made it this far, if you listen to me ramble this much, I really, really appreciate it. Definitely like and subscribe. And please comment down below what you thought of all this.